Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to our second panel, on misinformation and algorithmic amplification, race and religion. So, as we've talked about all day today, there is a growing concern in society about the spread of misinformation on Google platforms and its impact on democratic debates, on public health, and citizen global production. And our stellar four panelists are going to be talking today are bringing in multidisciplinary, transcultural, and cross-national understandings of how disinformation and information affect vulnerable and marginalized racial and religious minorities. So this could take the form of vaccine misinformation, health misinformation against marginalized groups during COVID-19. Could be in the form of deliberate propaganda shared on platforms in both authoritarian regimes and liberal democracies in the global south, including the form of election manipulation and meddling or the use and spread of deepfakes to discredit and discriminate against marginalized groups. That said, misinformation is false information that is spread regardless of its intent to mislead, and because of this distinction, Chuntang and I felt the need to also think about comprehensive and nuanced ways of understanding misinformation, also thinking about mitigation strategies. And so that is the reason we put together this panel to highlight also what the role of algorithmic amplification is and what the role of platforms is in the misinformation problem. So to talk about the role of platforms, please join me in welcoming our host, Dr. Kaplan. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Kaplan is an assistant professor at Duke University, Stanford School of Public Policy, and also a senior lecturing fellow in the Center for Science and Society at Duke University. And she conducts research at the intersection of platform governance and media policy. And her research examines the impact of inter- and intra-organizational behavior of platform governance and content moderation. And her most recent work examines the history of the verified badge or the blue check mark on platforms. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first panelist for today, Dr. Melissa Brown, who is an assistant professor of communication at Santa Clara University, and also who teaches media technology studies, digital feminism, and digital intimacies. So if you're ready, Dr. Brown, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me clearly. Thank you so much for joining me for my presentation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So the title of my project is a sociological analysis of COVID-19 misinformation on social media among racially marginalized communities. And today I'm going to kind of introduce you to the project in terms of a very specific way that I'm thinking about this project, primarily through the lens of online misinformation that pertains to Black Americans and using COVID-19 as a discourse as a part of the broader conversation. Then I'll touch on my research objectives, talk about the background that brought me to this project, briefly discuss the various types of methodology that are brought to bear for this project, some of my findings, particularly on specific platforms due to time constraints, and then talk about the importance and implications of these findings as part of my conclusion. So pictured here is an image from a YouTube video that is titled "Coronavirus Cannot Live in Alkaline Body, Dr. Sebi." The video was posted on April 11th, 2020. And in the description of the video, it reads, "Dr. Sebi has always told us to alkaline our bodies, fast, and stay away from acidic foods." And then this part that I highlighted here, it reads, "Coronavirus is being compared to other illnesses like cancer, and cancer can be cured." And so I found this particular video to be really intriguing in terms of how it framed kind of the project that I'm really interested in, and basically talking about the ways that people, particularly from Black American backgrounds, turn to internet information in order to kind of cultivate their health knowledge around the height of the pandemic, and some of the ways that certain existing beliefs kind of framed their perspectives. So who is Dr. Sebi? So for those of you who don't know, I want to clarify that Dr. Sebi is not actually a medical doctor. He was born Alfredo Darrington Bauman in Honduras in 1933, and he's better known as a herbalist and a healer. And so through his work, he conceptualized what is known as the alkaline diet. And so this particular diet basically emphasized that people need to rid their diets of acidic foods and also practice fasting in order to cure illness. And so in particular, the illnesses that he purports that the alkaline diet can cure are those that, particularly in the Western framework, we know require vigorous medical intervention that go beyond simply practicing certain types of eating habits. However, this type of knowledge that he shared and circulated in his role as a herbalist and healer is really appealing, particularly to racially marginalized individuals. And so I want to have a conversation about that today and the role of social media in circulating his beliefs. So my project has 3 goals, and I kind of wanted to address the ways that we know that racially marginalized groups, particularly Black and Indigenous people, were heavily affected by the COVID-19 virus, and disproportionately affected it in terms of cases, hospitalizations, as well as deaths. And so I think it's important to study health discourse on social media because this group has not only limited access to healthcare, but also has historically faced educational inequalities that probably contribute some to the distorted perceptions of the best ways to obtain health knowledge and access. But also this group is heavily reliant on social media. So Black Americans in particular make up a significant portions of the users of platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter. And so this demographic is a really key demographic to think about when we want to have conversations about the role of public health crises in the digital age. So my research objectives are threefold. So first, I want to be able to explore how information about COVID-19 is created, shared, and discussed on platforms like social media, specifically among Black Americans. And I think that this idea of COVID-19 information being shared online is definitely an emerging field. I think from the very beginning of 2020, it was clear that public health scholars, sociologists, and other people interested in health were really kind of aware that social media was playing a key role in kind of challenging and confronting some of the public health attempts to kind of curtail the virus's spread in the early days. And I specifically focus on Black Americans, given my own research background, having studied the role of Black Americans in the cultivation of social media activism, digital culture, and pedagogy. And so additionally, I'm really interested in gaining insights into the, getting insights into the perspectives and interactions of Black Americans with COVID-19 related information on social media, again, because in particular, this group has really taken up space on various mobile social internet platforms. And so the internet and online discourse is a key way that Black Americans kind of come to expressing their knowledge and awareness of health. And by doing so, I ultimately want to better understand the impact of COVID-19 misinformation on racially marginalized groups. And by using that knowledge, I want to be able to develop strategies to address and combat that misinformation effectively. So the frameworks that I'm grounding this study in, I think of it as a sociology of knowledge project that also intersects with digital sociology as well as Black studies frameworks that are invested in Black internet culture and practices. I think it's important to think about how knowledge is socially constructed, especially when we take into account intersectionality and being aware that the social positionality of these individuals plays a key role as to how they understand health knowledge. And then, of course, digital inequality, which historically we framed of digital divide. But I use the framework of digital inequality to kind of point to the ways that social structures like racism and capitalism contribute to the inequality in access, knowledge, and use that we see historically among Black Americans in the United States and Black people globally. And then finally, Black Digital Studies Framework is a more agentic framework when we think about the use of information and communication technologies among Black people. And it allows me to think about the ways that Black people are agents of health knowledge as they use social media to address COVID-19 information and knowledge. So, of course, as I mentioned, the racial disparities in COVID-19 impact is a key reason why I think this is an important conversation to have. So the CDC reported that in 2021, Black Americans compared to white non-Hispanics had 1.1 times as many COVID-19 cases, 2.8 times as many COVID-19 hospitalizations, and then 1.9 times as many COVID-19 deaths. And of course, Indigenous Americans were also very heavily affected by the pandemic as well. And so beyond their outsized impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on these groups, I was also interested in the idea of the roots of racialized health disparities. So one, thinking, of course, of the socioeconomic inequalities that pre-existed the COVID-19 pandemic, which positioned Black Americans to be more exposed. So for example, nearly 2 in 5 Black Americans are frontline workers, these essential workers rather, who weren't able to get accommodations such as working from home to mitigate their exposure to the virus prior to the release of the vaccine. Another issue is that there is already a pre-existing limited access to healthcare and resources. And so as a result, Black Americans have lower rates of COVID-19 vaccination. And then lastly, and of course, key to this project is the fact that Black people have been subject to medical and scientific racism. So one of the key exemplifiers of that is the Tuskegee syphilis study, and that in a previous research has come up about a factor for a lot of Black Americans in terms of being susceptible to certain types of COVID-19 misinformation. And so this Tuskegee syphilis study kind of sows mistrust among Black Americans about Western medicine. So in the context of both that disparate impact of COVID-19 and the roots of racialized medical neglect that Black Americans experience, there's also the fact that historically, Black Americans have turned to social media because of the ways that they have experienced digital inequality as a result of racial segregation and prejudice. So prior to the mobile internet era, if we think about having to access the internet through things like DSL and personal computers, the cost of access and the ease of access to those types of devices were more difficult for Black Americans to obtain. But since the advent of smartphones and mobile internet, Black Americans have a huge online presence. And in particular, on platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, we see the ways that Black Americans are using the mobile internet to kind of shrink the racialized information gap. And so through their emergence onto the internet, there has emerged a Black cyberculture. And through that Black cyberculture, Black people create a digitally mediated Black identity where they can represent themselves, where they can contribute to culture and technology, where they can shape politics, as well as participate in everyday life. So my research questions are: one, how does social media play a significant role in keeping Black Americans informed, educated, and connected, particularly in the face of challenges accessing information and resources caused by segregation? And then two, what is the impact of social media in bridging the information gap and empowering marginalized communities during public health crises like COVID-19? So my methodologic approach is very broad, particularly given recent changes with a lot of these social media platforms about how you can access their data. So of course, I take the kind of the standard approach of collecting user data. I chose Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, and TikTok because these are spaces and places where Black Americans have a relatively high presence, except for Reddit, but I also kind of wanted to use Reddit as like a comparative case to see if the framework of that particular platform plays a role, which is another factor. If we look at Twitter and Reddit, these are more text-based platforms, whereas YouTube and TikTok are more video-based platforms. And so I specifically look at posts that are related to Black Americans and the COVID-19 virus, and I decided also to focus on important dates. So kind of within the realm of the first wave of lockdowns in March 2020, as well as the FDA's approval of Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine in August 2021. These are just examples of some of the key dates. And then In addition, I also use natural language processing to analyze textual content. So for example, not only the captions of videos or posts themselves, but also replies and comments. And I use that to identify popular phrases, analyze user networks, examine sentiment and emotion, and also generate topic models. And then lastly, I investigate user-generated content linked to Black Americans and COVID-19 through digital ethnography. And so thinking about the ways that this media emerges in a particular user interface and making sure that I'm aware of how the user interface shapes particular conversational and network dynamics. So not just kind of creating a large data set that's divorced from the framework, but thinking about how the user themselves navigates the interface and how navigating that interface can contribute to a certain type of knowledge that emerges on these platforms. And so, of course, I'd use that to generate a topology as a result. So one of the examples that I'm showing here is from a Reddit post that was about the conspiracy. And so the claim here is that when Dr. Sebi discovered the cure for HIV/AIDS, which is Dr. Fauci's kind of crowning achievement in terms of how we know him for having dealt with that earlier crisis. The claim is that because Dr. Sebi was going to find a cure, he was being harassed and persecuted by the government. So this type of framing, for one, promotes an alternative medicine as well as conspiracy theories at the same time. Another example here is a TikTok video. Let me go ahead and play it real quick.
Wait a minute. Y'all know Dr. Fauci, but don't know Dr. Sebi? Now I see what's really wrong with the world. A man who cured AIDS, who cured many diseases, proven, is less trusted than a man who, what does he do again? Oh no.
So that video kind of indicates, one, an admiration for Dr. Sebi, but also a mistrust of the medical establishment, particularly pharmaceutical companies as well. And so some of the top comments that reinforce this belief is the Black one saves lives, the white one takes lives. And then the second one was, I know Dr. Sebi, but not Fauci. So again, these comments kind of indicate a mistrust of Dr. Fauci as a figure of Western medicine and an embrace of Dr. Sebi, not only as a Black man, but also a figure of alternative medicine. And so then this last image is from Twitter. And so again, it kind of reinforces this belief that Dr. Sebi is capable of giving a cure, particularly through this diet. And again, this idea of this diet being able to cure is through this belief in mucus being the cause of COVID-19. And again, asserting that Dr. Sebi found a cure for bronchitis, which also is caused by excess mucus. So therefore, he has found a cure for COVID-19 through his diet. So ultimately, I have a little bit of time, but these themes kind of speak to a reverence for Dr. Sebi, but also skepticism about medical and pharmaceutical establishments. They also communicate intrigue and suspicion about the life of Dr. Sebi, claiming that external forces conspired against him. And ultimately, this Dr. Sebi discourse, on the one hand, celebrates his life and promotes alternative medicine, but does so in a way that spreads dangerous misinformation. And thinking about the ways that this figure is kind of key to Black Americans in particular gives exposure to how racially and ethnically marginalized groups are kind of uniquely affected by COVID-19 misinformation. So in conclusion, I just wanted to point out that I think social media plays a significant role in shaping the experiences and perspectives of Black Americans during public health crises. It has a noticeable impact on racially marginalized community, particularly Black Americans, and that understanding the impact of COVID-19 on racially marginalized communities is crucial going forward, as we know the ways that these crises are kind of on the rise. And so I also want to kind of ultimately promote this idea of bridging theory and practice. So using the information from studies like these to kind of develop interventions that can be more targeted to these groups in order to effectively combat misinformation. And thank you. I look forward to your thoughtful reflections on this.
Bowling Green University.
second year PhD student. I have a couple of years of experience, so it is difficult, but in 2020, year of riot, which was based on a derogatory Facebook post targeting the prophet. And because of this post, there were lots of riots. About 200 people were arrested, about 5-6 people were killed, and countless were injured. Now, the interesting aspect about this is that this post is still valid. We still do not know if the post that was posted was right or wrong. That has not been discovered. Similarly, Similarly, Delhi riots were also in 2020. This was based out of sit-in protest against the Citizen Amendment Act, which I think a lot of us will be familiar with. And this caused a whole disruption in the northeast part of Delhi, which is the capital, and there were tensions between Muslims and Hindus. Over 53 people died, a lot more injured, and there was retaliation from both sides, weapons used, and so on. Why am I saying this is because what we need to understand is that there is this blindness that is driving people. There is this communication between online platforms and offline platforms that is being transferred, which seems to be invisible in many ways and not really spoken about enough in academia. So I want to talk about how on social media platforms, especially in times of crisis, there is this huge ambiguity information that is created. And this, for many reasons, is fulfilled by a lot of studies that conspiracy theories talk about epistemic reasons, social reasons, and also things that will make you feel good. So there are many ways that blindness is driving. But one of the most important aspects, I think, is emotion. And to understand that, I go to Sarah Ahmed. I hope I can explain her if anyone's ever heard she's hard to understand. So we talk about object stickiness. So she talks about this relationship between objects and emotions and how a repeated exposure to these objects, which can be physical and which can be also just cultural aspects, and how a repeated exposure to that sort of develops this meaning, okay? And that creates affective economies, which is basically, so she talks about emotions are made, shared, and valued in our society, and they are not just personal and are influenced by happening around us. So the feelings are specific to certain places and also influenced are constantly evolving, and media plays a huge role in that. Okay. So basically what I'm trying to say that in context of social media platforms, I'm trying to say that the circulation of emotions is being materialized and amplified, and this is contributing to development of these ambiguous spaces, and that is creating this rise for authentication protocols that go beyond verified data. So similarly saying social media platforms, we tend to align with socio-ideological matches on these platforms, and that really establishes the authentication processes for a lot of individuals. And with a lot of polarization, it becomes much bigger and so on and so forth. Now, this becomes fourfold when it comes in contact with platform performativity. It's when a story comes onto the platform, it has a life of its own. There is production, there is circulation, each one interprets it differently. And Drucker talks about that and how human interpretation gives meanings and values for different things. Right?
Okay, now now I painted a big picture. Now let's see if I can verify that and how I can do that, right? So I borrowed this data set from a previous work that I've done while I was at Microsoft India. And this is, I pretty much annotated about 3,000 misinformation stories manually. And I know. I thematized them for thematic patterns, trigger cases, style, and substance. I had a huge mental health battle after that, so another story for a dinner maybe. But for this paper, I especially looked at religious and gender related stories, and specifically focused on the Muslim community related stories over here. So I annotated them for the narratives, the visual cues, the keywords, platforms, languages, location, and so on. Now, this you need to understand that each fact-checked article is differently written. So the data cannot be very standardized. So it's harder to do quantitative research. So a lot of qualitative research is important in these days. Because every time there's not always, all the information is not available. Right. Quickly, what is authenticity? Why am I talking about? Initially, authenticity was about ethics and ethical following of yours, but now it is more like something that brings you success, and which is what we call strategic authenticity, and that's what Galen and Numitrica talk about. Now for the fun part. So I use repetition as a way of looking at these stories. And I'm interested in studying tactics and strategies of misinformation. So I use repetition here and I look at it as a tool and technique of authentication. I will explain further. So these are some stories that we see in my data. Before that. So this is a large narrative that is there, which is saying Hindu khatre mein hai, which means that Hindus in India are in danger. Okay, which is through the minorities. You can see how that narrative is being formed. So burning of Hindu gods. So now first let me make a disclaimer. I did not fact check these. These are fact checked articles already done by fact checkers. So I am not saying right or wrong. Okay. So burning of Hindu god pictures, which is done by Muslims. Vandalizing of Hindu temples by Muslims. A lot of stories like these evolve. Basically coming down to the fact that Muslims are aggressors and are individuals who disrespect and attack the beliefs of the Hindu majority. More stories. Pakistan against Hindu women. So there are stories about assaults of women in Pakistan. What is Pakistan? A Muslim-dominated country. There is Hindu women being assaulted by Muslims in India. So basically trying to say that Muslim men are perpetrators of violence, harassment, and assault and abuse, right? More. Muslims as spreaders of COVID. We might know about Corona jihad, and jihad is used everywhere. Anyway, it doesn't really mean what it means, but Muslims as spreaders of COVID. We have seen videos of Muslims licking plates, utensils, because they want to spread COVID. There is communalism of water contamination done by domestic health in the households. There are more stories on Muslim women being promiscuous. So that's the picture. This is very counterintuitive. It said 1,300 people became pregnant, women, in the Shaheen Bagh protest, and there were so many condoms. If you use condoms, how do you become pregnant? I don't know. But these were some stories. Then there were things about contamination of water and so on. Right, so again, bringing the narrative that Muslims are being deceptive, unethical, honest, or engaging in socially unaccepted events. And lastly, we use Pakistan flags everywhere in India. Honestly, it's the Indian Muslim League flag, but it's not the Pakistan flag. But Congress is always associated with Pakistan, and it is shown in everywhere. So these are some stories saying, did people wave Pakistan flag during the Bharat Jodo Yatra? So basically trying to say that the non-majoritarian party is supporting Pakistan and that Muslims are non-patriotic and want to disrupt the Hindu land. Breathing. These are some stories which come to the whole idea of basically that Hindu khatre mein hai, and then they are painting this object. So if you want to think about tool over here, I'm looking at the idea of aggressive assault, looking at the kind of imagery. It could be flags, it could be the skull caps that they're wearing. They're not necessarily always overt, but covert in the way things are. Now looking at technique and what happens with amplification, and I will end with that. So in the previous paper I borrowed the data set, this was the annotation that I mentioned. So we looked at that culture and adversity related information are more recirculated than newly fabricated, right? So it's harder to create something that is socially more observable. So if you see during COVID, we saw that COVID stories were newly created because COVID, we didn't have a pandemic before, but these stories are repetitively used again and again. So each story is used in different forms, in different ways, by changing narratives. It's used in deepfakes now, but I don't want to go to that direction, but this is something that is there. The other aspect that I really understood is the cross-platform and cross-lingual triangulation, which was, if in India we speak millions of languages, and there is this notion that the language that I speak, and if I encounter news in that, it's a bit more believable because maybe I relate to them a bit more. So I'm seeing that on my WhatsApp groups, then I'm also seeing English news channels, then I'm also seeing Hindi news channels. So there is this repetition of information in different languages that is allowing this, increasing this authentication for me, right? There is also validating the accuracy and credibility of content across different platforms. So I see it on Twitter, I see it on news channels. So it's the same information that is circulated in different things. And it's harder to study multi-platform studies. So I believe that's a big gap that at least I'm seeing. And reoccurrence phenomenon, basically same story reoccurring. There are paid apps which allow you to share the story and you gain stars and you get money out of it. So there are different ways that this is happening, and I'm not making this up, honestly. So yeah, this is one example. This is the story of a woman being harassed in Pakistan. Initially came in 2019, where the police officer was a man of that woman who was hitting her publicly. But again, it re-emerged. And if you see on the right-hand side, you see it's in different languages on YouTube and different videos. Those are the number of videos. So those kind of stuff. Basically, Hindu khatre mein hai. I don't know what to say, actually. So basically trying to talk about that there is this affective economy that is being developed through the emotion. There is this term that I recently learned about, memory actuants, right? So it's about the visual imagery that is remaining with us, whereas the message of the visual memory remaining with us while the image is still gone away. So there is this recirculation, there is this constant feedback. So for me, in my head, Islamophobia exists, whoever I am. I don't have to be educated or uneducated, and it's creating the vibes. So I think the question that I'm really asking is, if authenticity is being orchestrated and is defined as truth, what should we really verify? Because fact checking is failing, because fact checking happens 24 hours after and the harm is already done, and the images keep coming, right? Future work, my advisor would say this is very ambitious. I hope to achieve this, but so I'm interested in decision making on social media influencers as opinion leaders and understanding their verification. I'm interested in studying methodologies of correlating these online and offline events that I was talking about. And I'm interested in studying intent, because that's the biggest issue with calling it disinformation when it actually is. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Saida. Our next presenter is Darsana Vijay, who's a PhD student at the Faculty of Information, University of Toronto. Darsana.
Hello. Thank you for having me here. I think some of the background for my presentation has already been set up, so I'm very happy about that. Okay, so my paper that I will be presenting here is called Reassembling the Network of Hate, How Misinformation Around Tablighi Jamaat Spread on YouTube. So as Saida mentioned, misinformation in India is animated by a majoritarian communal politics of hate aimed at vilifying Muslims, Dalits, and other marginalized populations. Islamophobic content that variously demean, demonize, and exhort violence against Muslims spreads virally on Indian YouTube. A recent report that was published by NYU Stern highlighted in particular the misinformation campaign that portrayed Muslims who attended a religious convention called Tablighi Jamaat in March 2020 as being responsible for triggering the pandemic's first wave in India. Fact checkers have debunked various stories, including the one that was mentioned earlier about Muslims intentionally licking spoons to propagate the virus. But there's also others like Muslims misbehaving at quarantine facilities and so on. Mainstream media, on the other hand, lent mileage to these kind of misinformation, with the Republic TV spreading doctored audio recordings, as well as News Nation, which was in the previous slide, showing amplifying incendiary speech by politicians like Raj Thackeray, who advocated that Muslims be shot dead, circulating it among their millions of followers. So needless to say, understanding misinformation and the hate speech ecosystem in India is an uphill task. However, it is crucial that we do so considering the real world harm that Islamophobic videos condone, if not incite. So in this paper, I will be using a case study approach examining the YouTube discourse around Tablighi Jamaat. Okay, yeah, just to provide some context, Tablighi Jamaat is a transnational Deobandi Islamist revival movement that emphasizes piety and spirituality as the route to salvation. Despite their congregation in congregation in Malaysia being dubbed the largest viral vector in Southeast Asia by March 3rd, they conducted a similar gathering in Delhi between the 10th and 13th of March, attended by around 2,000 people without a lot of COVID safety precautions. On the 17th of March, the first case of COVID among the participants was registered. Nearly 4,300 cases could be traced back to the convention by mid-April, constituting about 30% of India's positive cases by that point. While the organization and the public administration were inept in preventing this outbreak, the COVID-19 cluster quickly became weaponized as a reason to demonize Tablighi attendees and all Muslims by extension, as intentionally propagating the virus, calling them Corona jihadis. As one of the most prominent COVID-19 related misinformation campaigns, Tablighi Jamaat deserves closer study. Further, this controversy was played out on YouTube that has a much more of a mass reach in India, even though it is rarely studied. This is even more surprising given what we know about YouTube's recommendation algorithms and their propensity to send users down rabbit holes of misinformation, as Zainab Tufekci put it. Taking on such an inquiry efforts an examination of the entanglement of politicians, legacy media, fringe content producers, and platforms in the making of a misinformation event. Doing such a situated analysis can contribute to academic discourse, which tends to view misinformation as solely the doing of a few bad actors. So this paper that I'm presenting will explore how Islamophobic misinformation spreads on Indian YouTube as a general, broad, overarching concern. Specifically, it examines how the discourse around a contentious topic like Tablighi Jamaat figures on the platform. Is it more likely that a user sees Islamophobic content when they search for Tablighi Jamaat, and if so, why? This paper also evaluates the efforts of mostly alternative media and other progressive outlets that are trying to counter this misinformation. How effective are they? Are they able to change the general bent of the conversation around Tablighi Jamaat? So with these questions in mind, I adopt a ANT as an actor network theory informed digital methods approach, looking at actors who are the people who are participating in the conversation, who really owns this issue and they're able to be influential, as well as the processes. How do they even become influential and visible on the platform? And finally, looking at the platform's own what does the platform do and how does the platform's technical design influence the nature and bent of the conversation that takes place within its auspices. So in the interest of time, I will be very brief about the methodology, but we can definitely talk about it more during Q&A. I use the scraper that is available through University of Amsterdam's YouTube digital tools, which extracts data using the YouTube API. This lets you simulate the search results for YouTube for any given query. So I first looked at the top 50 videos that a user would find between March 18th and May 1st, which is when this issue was at its peak. So I looked at the top 50 videos based on the platform's measure of relevance. However, I found out that misinformation countering content that tried to discredit some of these viral rumors were not really that were very marginal in this data set. And I noticed that they were using some distinct terms such as fact check or fake news, or Godi media, which refers to lapdog media that is compliant to the interests of the Hindutva state. So what I did then was to conduct two sets of separate queries, one that just looks at the conversation around Tablighi Jamaat in general, and another query that looked at Tablighi Jamaat in conjunction with either fake news, fact check, or Godi. And I used Gephi to visualize these networks. So this is just a simple Venn diagram that shows like a lack of that shows that there's a very little overlap between these two conversations, the conversation around Tablighi Jamaat in general, as well as the conversation around Tablighi Jamaat in conjunction with one of these terms, fake, fact check, or Godi. So you can see that the outlets that are present in this overlap include NDTV India, which at that time prior to acquisition was still one of the few legacy outlets that held authorities accountable, Deshbhakt, a progressive critical news commentary channel, and News Laundry, a prominent fact checker. The others, News Nation and ABP, are notorious for their pro-government Islamophobic content, while Lalantop tries to be neutral, but we will talk about this later. This is a preliminary indication that efforts to curb Islamophobic misinformation around Tablighi Jamaat occupies a distinct space on the platform, and that pro-government legacy media complicit in spreading hate speech and misinformation are still present in these critical spaces. So you can glean further insight into the nature of these conversations by looking at the top 5 videos for these search queries. The Deshbhakt's video analyzing the Tablighi Jamaat controversy and ABP's video interrogating the hypocrisy of Muslim politicians were among the most viewed in both lists. This is interesting given their stark contrast. While Deshbhakt's video chastises the media for their sensationalist and irresponsible reportage, ABP does just the same. Their videos demonize Muslims who attended the event, and they chide Muslim leaders like Owaisi and Omar Abdullah for being in the service of those who endanger the nation. By that, they mean Tabligh attendees and all Muslims. Among the top videos for the general search query included a very sober analysis by NDTV star reporter Ravish Kumar about the media's communalization of the pandemic. C News, another legacy outlet, in contrast, fanned communal tensions using us versus them narratives and blaming Tablighi Jamaat attendees for treason, lying, and breaking the law. Siyasat Daily, which used to be an originally Urdu newspaper, engages in efforts at reconciliation, explaining that Tablighi Jamaat is a peaceful, non-violent organization. This kind of competing frames where you have like critical voices, then you have a set that is pro-government, pro-Hindutva, and also Islamophobic, and another set that is pro-Islam or trying to offer clarifications from an Islam point of view is visible even in the second group. So you can see Palpal News, which is another Urdu outlet discussing the official statement by the Markaz and criticizing the lapdog media. News Laundry's media criticism segment, which is similar to Deshbhakt, and Lalantop's fact-checking video dispel the misinformation around Tablighi Jamaat. While we get a general sense of the camps that these videos belong to, we need to understand which viewpoints have greater carriage across the network and how influence is established on the platform. So please bear with me. I promise that we are not going to spend too much time looking at these crazy network graphs. But so this is the extracted channel network from related videos for the search query Tablighi Jamaat. So this would capture both videos that are put out by ABP News as well as its connections to others that are recommended as the up next or related video section in YouTube. So all I want you to pay attention to is these kind of color-based groupings that you see here, whereas these are like Tamil channels, and then you have that's a South Indian language. So you have a few linguistic groupings. So this just indicates that these outlets associate with each other a lot more than they do with the rest of the group. And this is the larger network analysis for Tablighi Jamaat in conjunction with Fake, Fact Check, and Godi. But kind of winnowing down from all that mess to just looking at ABP in the search query Tablighi Jamaat. And just to kind of go back to these, you can see that ABP News occupies a very central position both in the overall search results for the general query Tablighi Jamaat, as well as for the more specific misinformation busting content that I've tried to identify with the second query. So in the first set, you can see that ABP, so ABP has a wide grip over most corners of the network discussing Tablighi Jamaat, getting linked to by reputed mainstream outlets like NDTV, BBC News, Times Now, and Hindustan Times, as well as newer digital outlets like the print, Lalantop, etc. ABP in turn links to diverse sources, including progressive outlets and fact checkers like News Laundry, Deshbhakt, and The Wire, as well as channels that are associated with Narendra Modi, who is the Prime Minister, Kapil Sharma, very kind of outspoken politician who openly advocates for violence against them, as well as this ultra-nationalist party called Shiv Sena that, So, and curiously or not, ABP is also quite centrally connected in the second network graph, which looks at the misinformation busting content. So when I looked at the 6 ABP videos that were surfaced for this misinformation busting query, the videos that were included in the set had nothing to do with misinformation or trying to counter misinformation. Several of them, in fact, were quite blatantly Islamophobic, as well as spreading unverified rumors or rumors that were already verified as not true. So this could be because of their heavy usage of hashtags, averaging about 19 per post, and as well as the channel's popularity as in terms of its follower count, which probably makes the algorithm consider it or assign it with greater importance. So then we look at the channel networks for some of these outlets that are focused on countering Islamophobic misinformation. So as you can see how the Urdu outlet Palpal News' sphere of influence is so circumscribed to a tiny corner of the map, whereas News Laundry is maybe slightly better, but not so much. The Wire, even though it is decently in between, is mostly conversing almost completely with mainstream media channel and not really reaching across the network. Lalantop is surprisingly heavily networked, which could do with their heavy entertainment, sports, and youth focus that lets them be associated with diverse channels. They also posted the most number of videos of all the channels surfaced in the search. So I just want to reiterate at this point that this kind of linking activity is not really or not completely within the control of the channels. A lot of it has to do with the YouTube channels, YouTube recommendation algorithms as estimates of affinity, relevance, and so on. And one kind of finding from here is that YouTube seems to circumscribe progressive news and fact-checking channels in a niche that is restricted to the news space. Whether this is the obvious consequence of user activity, the platform algorithm that is designed to pursue scale at any cost to maximize advertiser interest, or active linking activity that producers and users engage in, needs to be further explored. And another factor that needs to be considered is also the size and influence of these large legacy media channels, which are, which have follower counts in the millions, whereas the progressive alternative outlets are much smaller. Just getting into the implications. ABP centrality in both networks is concerning, as their incendiary, divisive, and misleading content that engages in fear-mongering commands so much importance and visibility, even in the misinformation busting critical space. This is definitely a function of ABP's location as a central node, acting as a relay point to YouTube's various neighborhoods. ABP centrality alludes to its significant agenda setting power. On the one hand, it can introduce misinformation into the video consumption pathway of a user who might have watched a fact-checking video first and then is recommended an ABP news video. On the other hand, ABP might further lead the user down rabbit holes of extremism by sending them to News Nation or something even more incendiary. This affects an alignment between ABP's mass or scale-oriented strategy and YouTube's business model that chases for views, capitalizing on and activating emotions, as Saida just mentioned, and affect to sell commodities, data, and advertisements. ABP's mass or scale strategy also has a prehistory that dates back to Indian media's privatization and liberalization that instituted a race for ratings and viewership. And now coming to alternative media, scholars like Revati Prasad, who studied alternative progressive news media, have noted that alternative outlets tend to be doubly elite, catering to a very small, liberal, English-speaking, upper-class caste audience. When YouTube reinforces this nichification by circumscribing alternative media into a tightly knit corner of the network map, it significantly impacts alternative media's ability to enter into and counter circuits of circulation of majoritarian content. Moreover, alternative media's scarce resources and their positioning as rare, credible voices on the landscape prevent them from taking a page out of ABP's playbook and engaging in SEO stuffing, SEO keyword stuffing, and hashtag overusing strategies, or even the mass volume of content that several of these legacy outlets are able to put out because of the considerably more resources that they have. Now, regarding the scholarly debate about YouTube, I can safely say that this is not a platform for free and equally safe expression. But I don't have an easy answer about YouTube leading users down extremist rabbit holes. Legacy media stature, predating the platformization of news, their complicity in spreading pro-government, majoritarian, and divisive rhetoric, and the very organized, decentralized network of political misinformation operatives and the political economy of the media system in India plays an equally important role. Yeah, rather than being deterred by this complexity, we need to work together to untangle this mess. That's all from me. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for sorry, I cannot hear the room in person, but I'll just start. Hi, my name is Sananda, and I will be presenting on algorithmic. Sorry. Can you see my slides?
Yeah. See presenter view though. We
Is
see
it
the
on-
interview. Can someone nandito that the mic say that we can only see the presenter view? You can't hear us. No, you can. It's unmuted.
Sananda, we can only see your slides and your comments on the site as well.
Okay. How do I change this? Can you see the slides as well as the comments now, or?
No, but it's not in presenter mode. Okay,
There, it looks
perfect.
great.
Yeah, looks great.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you can go back to what you did before.
Okay, then I cannot see my the notes. I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this, but just stop share and then I'll reshare.
So Sananda, so are you using like another display or monitor?
No, just this one, like the usual one.
Yeah, because sometimes like if you have another display, it will show you the presenter view, so you can see your notes.
Ah, okay. Sorry. I'll just reopen this thing. So can you see, oh, it's still showing the presenter view, right? I mean, with the notes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll just go without the notes. So I guess you can see the presenter view now.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So my presentation is on algorithmic amplification on Twitter, how it turns propaganda into misinformation. And to lay some context to this, the case that I take as a site of research is the Supreme Court verdict on the Babri Masjid demolition case. So on November 9th, 2019, when the Supreme Court of India passed its final verdict on the contested Babri Masjid demolition case, it brought to close a legal issue that goes back to the colonial era, long before the demolition of the mosque at the site in 1992. Religious and legal tension over the site goes back to 1850s. It is considered by a section of religious and political community to a holy Hindu site over which the founder of Mughal Empire, Babur, built a mosque. In the absence of recorded history that gives basis to the Hindu claims of holiness of the site, popular culture has been subsequently evoked to give credibility to the political religious claim and justify the demolition of the existing mosque. According to mythology, the site is the birthplace of a demigod and hence one of the holiest sites for some followers of Hinduism. The site has emerged as a heuristic device that represents the ideological underpinnings of the right-wing organizations and political parties that identify themselves with Hindutva, including the ruling party, which is a majority political party at the national level in India. For today's paper, my arguments are that misperceptions are intentional. Propaganda is not a misinformation per se, but when it is amplified through platforms such as Twitter, it amplifies the misperceptions, and then misperceptions should be examined as a result of propaganda, and misinformation and disinformation should be studied in relation to propaganda. The research questions that I ask are: what constitutes misinformation and disinformation in the light of propaganda? And what role does algorithmic amplification on the Twitter platform play in transforming propaganda and misperceptions into misinformation and disinformation? So on November 9th, the day of the verdict, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi tweeted twice, and I studied those two tweets and as well as reactions to his tweets. And I argue that the influencer status exploits Twitter affordances to project language ideology online for political gains. And for this, I use the concepts message and adressivity as defined by Lempert and Silverstein. On Twitter, the Prime Minister Modi uses Twitter as one of the primary platforms to address his base, and He has one of the largest followers on Twitter in India. As of yesterday, he had 92.4 million followers on Twitter. Before we come to this two tweets, I have to say that his supporters are described as middle-class, upper-caste Hindus and liberal expats who subscribe to his party's version of Hinduism. And this base is described by commentators as a sociological product who are fearful and angry population, gullible to the scepter of scapegoats such as Muslims, minorities, and refugees, among others. On social media, this base attracts as much hate and disdain for being divisive as they themselves heap upon others. Modi's appeal to this base is important to study to understand how he addresses his base as not only a prime minister, but also as the leader of a right-wing political party that identifies with a political homogeneous Hindu religious ideology. So these are the two tweets that he posted on November 9th. And scholars have argued that Twitter has turned out to be a perfect fit as a communication channel for populist leaders from Trump to Modi. In this, the affordances of Twitter are noteworthy. In the context of India, Modi's tweets help frame an issue. In this case of the Ayodhya verdict, Modi tweeted twice in English on the day of the verdict. In this verdict, the Supreme Court approved the construction of the Hindu or the Ram temple at the disputed site and directed the central government to allot an alternative plot of land in the city for a new mosque. Modi's tweets are notable because they stress on the issue of harmony between Hindu and Muslim communities, erasing any reminders of the recent history associated with the case. In 1992, leaders and supporters of the right-wing Hindu political party and several related organizations demolished the masjid, which is the Urdu word for mosque, in violation of the law. The demolition was accompanied by and followed by murders, rapes, and riots in several parts of the country. The day before the 2019 verdict, several state governments had taken measures such as canceling schools and deploying additional security forces on the streets to prevent communal violence. The announcement of the verdict did not attract any violence, though. Modi had tweeted the day before the verdict calling for peace and harmony. On the day of the verdict, his first tweet on my left-hand side calls for peace and harmony. On the day, it thereby erases the criminality of the act itself, while framing the verdict as neutral to either the Hindu or the Muslim community. It downplays the fact that the verdict did not declare anyone or any organization guilty, and thereby does not mean a victory for the Hindu organizations that were involved in the demolition. This is even more curious because the verdict did say that the demolition was in violation of law. The second sentence of the first tweet is a call to uphold Rashtra Bhakti or patriotism over any allegiance to religion. While this is a reminder of the secular principle of the country enshrined in the Constitution, the words frame the call to patriotism in Sanskrit language, which is associated with the Hindu rituals, and Rashtra Bhakti has also been called as Hindu nationalism. The second tweet frames the verdict more overtly. It not only upholds the verdict's harmonizing aspect by apparently not taking sides, but also stresses why it should be notable. It then frames the significance of the verdict in the terms of the government. By calling the Ayodhya case a dispute, the tweet reduces the criminal aspect of the case and the degree of violence associated with it. By telling this base that this dispute is amicably solved with this verdict, Modi tries to lay to rest any contestation that the verdict is anything but amicable. By telling his base that the verdict is amicable, the tweet tries to rally support for the verdict. By calling the case as solved, he is also erasing the fact that there were at the time of the tweet, and there continue to be several related cases under hearing at the Supreme Court and lower courts related to criminal charges. While Modi hailed the independence of the judiciary, there has been criticism of judiciary working in line with the executive. But the usage of our judiciary within quotes, is an attempt to address an inclusive base, which can be interpreted in this context as one that goes beyond the Hindu base. The tweet is a crafted text as the usage of the adjectives independence, transparency, and farsightedness reveal. The word choice corresponds to what the justice system should be ideally and covers the founding basis of the legal system. By calling everybody as equal before law, Modi resorts to a form of meta-pragmatic discourse where he equates himself with the base. Once he accomplishes that, the previous tweets fall in line with this goal where, because he and his base are equal, his previous perspectives on the verdict should be recognizable to his base. At the same time, however, he is resorting to the deference index, where he is, after all, superior just by being in the position to set terms of the framing of the message. By equating himself with the base, he at the same time tells his base that it is solidarity that binds them together, despite him being in a position of power as the Prime Minister. By not referring to the Babri Masjid demolition as the last major event related to the case, and by simply referring to the case as Ayodhya issue, both these tweets play with intertextuality, a form of intextualization where meaning is made by decontextualizing the discourse. With the gap created, Modi's supporters fill it with their own interpretation. And Modi's supporters are ardent Twitter users who resort to various types of tweets such as replies, mentions, and retweets to gather support for him. Among the 351 tweets that were unique out of the 1,000 tweets that I collected, 27 mentioned the words Hindu, only 2 mentioned the word Islam, 3 mentioned mosque, and 5 mentioned the word masjid. In most of the tweets that do not have an oppositional reading to Modi's tweets, the meaning is created through the key words to propagate a version of history that might be called the folk version of Ayodhya, that Muslims destroy Hindu temples, that Hindus are victims of in this context, and the destruction of one mosque in response to several temples historically is not a big deal. These are some of the tweets that were posted in response to Modi's original tweets. Many of the tweets are indexed through hashtags such as hashtag 6 months of Modi 2, 6 months of India first, hashtag Ram Mandir, and hashtag Ayodhya to rally support for the Modi government by equating the verdict in support of the temple construction with the indication of development of the country. The interpretations created by Modi's followers in response to his decontextualized tweets, therefore, share a common version of history, often seen as the bedrock of BJP's parent organization. And these are 2 more tweets from his followers that show how they are filling in with their when the original tweets erase the core problematics of the issue, people fill in with their own interpretation that then amplifies the Hindutva ideology through these tweets. So in conclusion, one can say that language ideology helps analyze the workings of power and ideology through language, through message and adressivity. One helps analyze the specific material aspects of language, and the effect is to show how language is used for political gains by obfuscating the criminal aspects of the case. And that's all from me. Sorry. I hope I'm on time.
Thank you so much, Sananda. And thank you so much to all the panelists for their wonderful presentations. So I would like to open the floor for questions, but I had some of my own. So I'm just gonna bring Dr. Kaplan to kind of think about all of these presentations on the American as well as the Indian information ecosystems, and also ask you a couple of questions, if that's okay. So my first question to you would be, do you think that platforms should be the private commercial regulators? Should they be the gatekeepers for private regulators of information? And also, is it possible to regulate misinformation?
I think that's an interesting set of questions. I just want to say, I really, really enjoyed all of these presentations by the panelists. And what kind of really came out to me from all of the presentations is the issue and the importance of trust when we think about misinformation. We have a lot of communities that are being studied here, where there is a problem of misinformation, but there is also a problem of, and an earned problem of trust within particular sources. And this came out really, really very strongly in a few of the presentations, especially the presentation on COVID-19 misinformation, that you have a historically kind of distrustful relationship with an institution, in particular kind of the medical institution in America. And what that is resulting in is people kind of turning towards their own communities to gain information because they no longer trust the information that's coming from authorities. This is a massive problem when we think about misinformation. So trust in general, at least within the context of the US, has really been in decline for some time, since we really started measuring it in the 1970s. Trust in media has seen massive decreases. And it kind of falls along the same lines that we tend to think of when we think about misinformation. So trust for Democrats is staying pretty stable. Trust for Republicans, I think, is down at 11%. Trust in media for Black communities is very low, strangely across Democrat and Republican communities. So we're seeing kind of the same sort of issue mirroring in terms of where we're seeing a lot of problems with misinformation, especially within marginalized communities who may have reasons for their lack of trust, being mirrored in how we think about trust within these institutions. From the perspective of technology companies, the interesting and really, really problematic part of this is that out of any of the institutions that we currently have right now, trust in tech is declining faster than any other institution. There was a really interesting study that was done by CSMAP at NYU, where they did the kind of general social survey that's been done since the 1970s. They're asking people about trust in institutions, and they add technology to that. And they found out of any of these institutions, when they surveyed about Facebook and Google, that they were the ones that were slipping the fastest. And that seemed to be true irrespective of partisan divides and demographics. So when we think about the role that platform companies have to play in this, we have to think about that trust issue. Do we trust these companies to be able to make these distinctions? Especially now when we're seeing, that these companies and their owners can be fairly capricious, they can change things at will, which can have kind of ripple effects across the industry. From a regulatory perspective, what I have seen that's kind of been most promising, can we regulate it? Jury is still out on that. The DSA has put forward some interesting proposals about involving civil society organizations that would really speak to some of the concerns that were presented here by the panelists about having marginalized communities have a voice. But my concern is that, the way I used to answer this question, which is that these platforms need to really up their resources. We need to regulate how many resources that they have to give to these problems. We are already, that's no longer even the conversation, because these platforms have they're just gutting content moderation. They're gutting trust and safety. They're moving towards things like generative AI that has real issues with training data, particularly around, marginalized communities. So that is my short answer to your question. I wanted to throw that issue to the presenters, though. I wanted to ask you guys about where you think this issue of trust within communities plays a role in terms of what you've studied. How can we think about misinformation through the lens of trust? How can we think about building back trust within particular institutions where we're really seeing this kind of loss and breakdown? You're the person, so you get to go first.
The things on top of my head is basically there was this one study which was talking about fact checkers in conjunction with local community. So there was this feedback loop model that was sort of built where the flagging is also happening from the community versus the fact checkers are fact checking it. But because of the nature of hyper local news, it comes back to the feedback loop and the local. So I feel like that's a lot of transparency, and that might be something that is possible, but that's just me in the wild, and I honestly have no idea. But initially I always thought that niche community networks would be the sources, but I feel like they are the biggest issues now. So I'm not so sure.
I'll go ahead and respond as well, since I think in my research, kind of the key thing that I'm realizing as a finding is that the pursuit of alternative medicine is rooted in mistrust, but for people of color, it's layered in that mistrust isn't just about not trusting medical establishments, but also not trusting medical establishments to not perpetuate racism against them. And so I find that this is about people trying to essentially crowdsource knowledge when they are aware that they in some way, shape, or form are being disenfranchised. I think it can kind of parallel the ways that information is sought online in relation to police brutality, which Black people are also disproportionately affected by. The difference being, however, in that a lot of the source of information for police brutality is people with firsthand experience, whether they be activists or victims, survivors. And so that firsthand experiential knowledge is rooted in a lived fact, in a sense that, adhering to a particular type of diet can kind of give people the illusion of control, but ultimately can't reverse the ways that particular illnesses progress. And so it was really intriguing to me the ways that I think, I can't remember her name, she's in the room, the young woman who's just speaking previously, she mentioned that there was like this repetition of like patterns. So like regardless of what the focus is, the pattern repeats. And I think that's kind of adheres to the same thing with it seems as though regardless of whether they feel as though they're being disproportionately affected by cancer or bronchitis or other types of illnesses, Black people have a belief that they can kind of alter their diet in some way and not have to rely on Western medicine as the cure. So I think to the point of restoring trust, then it's kind of one, a form of, I guess, reparations, in the sense that you can't just ask people, take this vaccine, but also say, hey, we are aware that we are an institution that has historically disenfranchised you. We seek to change and shift that relationship. So we would like to provide resources, and kind of thinking about the ways that you can connect on that level with the acknowledgement of the harm done, in addition to creating new interventions, and then allowing people to be the lived experience person. So I know from anecdotally, like a lot of people who are hesitant about vaccines would then go get it once they learn that their brother, mother, father, somebody close to them had gone and gotten the vaccine. So that lived experience knowledge was enough to overcome the online misinformation. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
I can also say something about it, but I don't think I will have a very clear answer because, first of all, the issue of trust is also closely tied to communities as well. And before I start saying that, I think it's important, especially in the Indian case, where there is an organized campaign to discredit minorities and anybody who opposes the pro-government majoritarian rhetoric. There is a consolidated effort to discredit or to sow distrust. So how do you speak of trust in such a place? So that's something that is very important. And as I've tried to show through the presentation, it's a bit like YouTube's, video views or the number of channels that number of followers for a channel. All of them kind of start standing in for a measure of trust. Like, so many millions of people have watched this video, so obviously there might be some truth to it. So yeah, so that is one thing that I would be very cautious of when we think about trust. The other thing which makes this issue even more complicated is the fact that Dr. Sahana Udupa from LMU has studied fake news or hate speech sharing behaviors on Indian platforms, and she's found that a lot of people share misinformation and hate speech not because they know that it's true or they believe that it's true, but they think that it's their patriotic duty to share information that villainizes another community that they think are completely opposed to theirs, so like are out to destroy them or whatever. So yeah, so how do you talk about trust in that sense? Like, so the question of trust is a very complicated one. I think I'm going to stop there for now.
Okay, fabulous.
Yeah, like in the case that I studied, and I think that's an issue that most of the researchers, as Darshana and Saida pointed out, who work in the Indian context, find that it's not the issue of trust per se, but people knowingly further and promote a certain kind of erasure of the nuances of an issue to identify with the community or a population group that will that basically leads to propaganda and erasing the nuances of an issue or the problematics of an issue. Because if you look at even for this one case of the legal hearing, people were, as much as they were talking about or furthering their Hindu identity or the communitarian aspect of it, there were equally strong comments where Twitter users talk about how these Modi's tweets are like empty words. It's like and that it was a one-sided verdict, or it's the Hindu nationalism, or Rashtra Bhakti is a form of Hindu nationalism, and that the Supreme Court did observe that this was an unlawful act. So even by knowing, so people respond to these resistant tweets by more extremist tweets, which is pro-Hinduism or anti-minority. So it's not trust in the context when you translate it to at least to the Indian context, but more about identification with a group.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I had some questions. I guess anyone of you could fill this. I think Dr. Brown talked about this. Actually, I'm not sure. Is Dr. Brown already a doctor?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. Dr. Brown talked about this a little bit in terms of the deep stories that are often attached to propaganda. And I'm less familiar with some of the cultural contexts in which the other presentations were made for today. So I would love a little bit more on, like, a lot of you were talking about the recycled nature of these campaigns, that most of the information isn't in fact new, that it's often like recycled, and this is the big thing obviously in my own work. And so the reason why this works is because it's activating those deep stories. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more. I mean, Dr. Brown briefly talked about it, but I'd love to hear more about her discussion on it, or any of the panelists thinking us through a little bit more about why this recycled content ends up being so incredibly
I mean, in context of what I was talking about these, that's what I was speaking about, object stickiness, that what Sarana talks about, right? So when I was trying to analyze those visuals, it took me back to the whole idea of divide and conquer that the British had through the whole colonialism history, and the analysis which I found about aggressors, perpetrators. I feel like those are re-emphasizing the same characteristics, playing into the negative stereotyping. playing into stigmatization and the communal tensions that sort of are there. And secondly, there is this whole visibility of who is superior, who is not, patriotism in cinema. I feel like it's just that a lot of narratives that are coming in, which are not new at all, but have been historically prevalent because Hindustan was Hindu land itself. In many ways, I understand why they're fighting for it, honestly, but that's the whole conversation that is reperpetuating. So it's that belief that sort of inherently exists in many ways. So I feel like it's just a repetition of those. So it's, I believe in it somewhere. I might not really believe in it now, but I know where they're coming from. And so you continue believing in it and sharing it. That's, I feel like it's just that kind of a perception.
Yeah. One of the things that I found really interesting in Saida's presentation was what you said about contamination, which also is something that has a history to it, because in India, this dates back to the legacy of the caste system, where upper caste Hindus were supposed to be the most pure, and the people who were below or outside the caste hierarchy could pollute by touching or by even being in the sight of an upper caste person. So this idea of pollution and like contamination by some kind of bodily fluids or even by their mere existence is something that I think as a society, or at least as a Hindu society, you are kind of inculcated in when you are at a very young age as part of culture or whatever. So when you have these things about like people licking something or like, you know, something of that sort, that is that immediately evokes that idea of contamination. And obviously in when it's around a disease which also has a focus on spreading by mucus or sneezing or whatever, this aggravates the kind of fear that comes, like the fear of contamination, that is kind of like, what is it, an underlying story or a running theme in our culture.
Yeah, and just to add to Darshan and Saida's points, and to speak to why such a recycled content now that we are seeing in the digital sphere end up being so productive and sticky, I think because they appeal to and speak to the historical prejudices that have existed and still exist, not only in India but also in US. So it feeds those historical prejudices, and as we saw from Professor Brown's presentation, also to the mistrust towards the institutional services, and it has been like, at least in both the countries, we can see that how these prejudices have been exploited over and over again through centuries for governance purposes. It makes population the problems of population more manageable, I think.
Yeah, I want to echo what everyone else was saying. And so I think to contextualize my study specifically, the reason why certain ideas are so sticky is because that they're not necessarily ideas, but more so expressions of an ideology. So in the case of Dr. Sebi, he predates digital media because he's essentially just doing Black cultural nationalism or Afrocentric thought. And so there is already an existing infrastructure for embracing these ideas within the Black community. These people who kind of offer alternative medicine, not only as a means to resist Western medicine, but also a means to resist white supremacy. And so because the culture is already kind of primed to embrace these types of practitioners, I think that there was a parallel with the particular stickiness with that. These public health crises came in the years after the racial crisis of kind of Barack Obama exposing the contradictions in the society where we can elect a Black president but have very racist, populace. And so the ways that there was a backlash to Barack Obama, and then kind of leading up to the Black Lives Matter movement, digital media playing a role in that as well, kind of Afrocentric discourses get more popular, not only in the realm of resisting police brutality, but also resisting white supremacy more generally. And so public health becomes a realm again to try to kind of resist white supremacy. So I think the stickiness kind of is rooted in this idea of, again, what was mentioned earlier, group identification, but also that the group identification requires a particular ideology that can be practiced regardless of whether or not it's in digital space, or whether or not it's specific to certain types of incidents. But it's definitely about an attempt at an anti-racist response to white supremacist crises. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
So this question is mainly, I would say, Darshana, Saida, and Sananda, all of you all in different contexts talked about this idea of algorithmic amplification of dis and misinformation. I was wondering within the Indian context, because we know so much of this dis and misinformation is also spreading on WhatsApp, where the algorithm is not necessarily playing a role, and it's more organic, and it's kind of going from bigger public groups to smaller private groups. How do you see the role of the algorithm itself in spreading dis and misinformation, and how do we distinguish that from what we've talked about right now about this idea of just these pre-existing biases that lead to people kind of more organically sharing this kind of information? How much blame do we put on the algorithm, and how do we kind of distinguish between what is causing the spread of this dis and misinformation?
Yeah, I think I could say a little bit about it. First of all, I don't study WhatsApp so much, so and I don't really know how you would do that, because you are not like, unless you talk to people and gain access, or you become a member of the group, it is very hard to penetrate and study. But another part of it, okay, so like last year or so, one of the alternative news outlets, The Wire, had done this expose on this like political misinformation campaign, or rather the BJP's IT cells, inner workings and all of that. And like that report is currently under review. So take this with a pinch of salt. But one of the allegations that they mentioned was that they were using ShareChat, which is an Indian social media platform, as a test bed to find out which kind of videos are likely to go viral. So this helps them estimate the popularity or potential popularity of a post, which can then determine which ones make it to WhatsApp. And the other thing is that I am not sure how much of misinformation on WhatsApp is organic, of people seeing something and thinking that, oh, I should send this to my friends, because this is also quite widely orchestrated, where you have this one right-wing person in your family group who gets his information from another larger right-wing group that he is part of, and then that comes from somewhere else. So it's like a decentralized architecture that has someone who's actually overseeing and like analytically determining the best way of sending misinformation. So yeah, that's what.
Good answer. I was talking about Drucker, right? So platform performativity. So she doesn't only talk about algorithm and recommendation models or any of that, but she talks about this human interaction with digital text and how that produces meaning and circulation. So if you look at that on WhatsApp, I feel like the question here is, the answer here is intentionality. And if you're talking about algorithmic amplification, I was talking about cross-referencing, triangulation. I feel like that whole existentiality, that epistemic reasoning sort of plays into intentionality, and that's what you generally tend to share on WhatsApp in the groups, because you're more comfortable in those niche. And then it's about subscribing to your socio-ideological matches. So that's the authentication that has been done, which is being shared. So how organic it really is again becomes a question mark, because the priming has already happened and the framing is already being done. It's just about the communication. So I'm thinking it's somewhere there.
Yeah, and I would echo all the panelists. I would just say that algorithms come into play in amplification of this of misinformation, disinformation. I mean, even before we had technology platforms, there were misinformation and disinformation campaigns, but it just technology just amplifies it in the way that it amplifies this erasure. For instance, in this, if you see, look at the in this case of Modi's tweets on the verdict, he calls it an Ayodhya issue or dispute. It's not a dispute, it was the demolition. So he avoids calling it the demolition of a historic architecture and the criminal cases that have been appended to this demolition. He calls it a dispute, and with that, it kind of amplifies the the communitarian aspect that, oh, we have to come together as even again the binary gets amplified, that it's a Hindu Muslim thing rather than the the real politic nature of the issue.
I want to do a shout out actually. Well, a researcher at Data Society, Sarita Amrute, has been doing a massive project for the last few years on misinformation in WhatsApp communities in India. So that's going to be a book soon. So eventually we will have some research. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to stop for coffee break and we'll come back at 3. Next panel. Thank you.